Welcome to the Tech Trek, where technology leaders share their insights, experiences, and views. Every week I bring you a new guest. And on today's episode,
Sri Sethapathi. He is the VP of Data and Analytics at Age of Learning in Los Angeles. And we're going to be focused on a couple of things today: building teams, industry trends in the data engineering and data scientist space, interviewing, successes and failures. And also, Sri has been an advisor with a couple different startups. So we'll touch on that. Hey, Sri, thanks for joining. Feel free to tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Great. First of all, thanks, Arash, for having me here. It's always a pleasure to meet you and be part of this amazing podcast. In terms of my background, I have lived and breathed the data analytics space, if you will, for the past 15 to 17 years. My very first stint was at EDS back in the day under President Bush's Medicare Part D implementation program, where I was one of their very first batch process developers dealing with tons and tons of revenue and subscription data. And ever since, I have grown organically into roles across a wide plethora of industries: retail, digital media, advertising, online, OTT, streaming, combined with healthcare analytics and educational technology realms. My most recent roles have been focused primarily in the early stage growth company / entrepreneurial realm, both at GoGuardian, where as part of the founding member of the educational technology startup about 6 years ago, I ushered in the entire product engineering as well as the data regimen into the company. It was a great success story for us in the context of Google Ventures virtually buying us out, if you will.
That's definitely a success.
In terms of the machine learning and the underlying data analytics capabilities. And to sort of take a back step and really talk to you more about the journey overall, if you will. It has been, I should say, developing a strong sense of product engineering through the lens of data, be it at Yahoo, where I ran the search advertising, the display advertising side of the verticals, combined with some of the $1 billion plus user sites, if you will, on a monthly basis: Yahoo News, Sports, Finance, Weather, from a media engineering side. So there has been a central theme of product and engineering sort of intersecting with the whole data story. And
Sure.
As a follow-up to Yahoo, I also landed up at Hulu, being hired as their first data executive responsible for bootstrapping the entire data analytics organization. So it's definitely been a rewarding journey. There is a lot more to learn, and really looking forward.
Awesome. Yeah, the journey never stops. I know you've had a great amount of time building teams from scratch. And I always think, you go in, and that's a challenge in itself. You don't have anything kind of as a blueprint. And I know in this particular role at Age of Learning, it wasn't necessarily from the ground up. But I was curious, when you go into a situation where you're looking to build a team out and across different kind of teams, whether it's, BI, data science, data engineering, what's your initial kind of thought process when you go into that situation? What are you looking to accomplish? And then what do you go into it and do?
Great question. Frankly speaking, to me, it's a two-dimensional function, when it comes to growing and nurturing organizations, Arash. First step, you really need to understand what the pulse of the organization is overall. When it comes to the strategic priorities of your investors, the board, and as an extension, the executive team, it's very critical that, when you find yourself in a new organization, you set the right tone in terms of building bridges and building the right relationships. So for me, that essentially becomes my 30, 60, 90, if you will, in terms of onboarding into a new organization. And as a function of that, I start looking at the more tactical elements of building the team in terms of whether we have the right people in the right roles and responsibilities, evaluating talent, evaluating the technology that is responsible for powering some of the core data engineering workflows. And when you sort of overlay the two dimensions together, it results in the what we call as a SWOT analysis through the organization. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Where is it that I can find opportunities? And I lay that against a long-term intrinsic plan for the organization over the course of the next 6 to 8 months. What should this organization effectively look at? What are all some of the roles that we need to hire for? Should we load balance some of the critical priorities within resources in the existing teams? And since you brought up Age of Learning as an example here, Age of Learning is a very interesting educational technology company in the sense that it operates at the intersection of content and personalized learning experiences built on top of a very strong machine learning cadence that powers a lot of its core learning regimen. We are responsible for producing award-winning games that cater to pre-kindergarten all the way through eighth grade students worldwide. So when it comes to the function of data and analytics as a cross-functional discipline, it was important that I was able to take in both the product analytics as well as the core engineering priorities and have a rationalization between the two.
Sure.
And as a result of which, we were able to come up with an annual plan of what would augment our existing capacities, both in terms of an engineering as well as in terms of a resourcing standpoint.
How often, when you're going in before you start your analysis, are you having discussions with other executives and or leaders in product and engineering? And do you try to make that a big focal point initially, kind of understand the lay of the land, so to speak, and understand what high level kind of is driving and looking for data to drive in the business? How do you go about kind of fusing all those together before you start figuring out, okay, the SWOT analysis and things like that?
Great question. Frankly speaking, it's really, to me, that's like the fundamental linchpin of your success at this level in the organization. Arash, when you are the face of an organization, it's highly imperative that the leaders around you and the larger data community within your organization can relate to your vision and the sort of questions you bring to the table. Because as you may know, data is a highly cross-cutting discipline, and sometimes what people want to hear may not be the status quo. As an example, at Age of Learning, there were some fundamental product experimentation practices which were very archaic, and I didn't feel comfortable moving into the newer learning analytics world with these technologies and processes. So one of my first orders of priority relating to your question was to really get that buy-in from the larger executive group, my product leaders, my business leads, my senior management executives running finance and marketing and other teams. And as an extension to that, once they saw where is it that we are going as an organization, they were able to quickly jump in and align as a team.
Sure. So it sounds like you identified something that needed to be worked on and improved, and that's obviously step one. And then once you identified that, how did you actually go about bringing that up to product owners and maybe other executives that they had created that product or gone and made those decisions to be at that point? Obviously, now you're coming in, a new person, saying, hey, this really can't be the way we move forward. And obviously that might have been kind of how they had put something in place before. How do you navigate that water?
No, definitely, that's a very tricky subject, to be honest, in the context of understanding your audience. And as you rightly called out, data can sometimes be a very abstract function in the eyes of the non-product and engineering teams, not really understanding what the long-term semantics of that would be. In this particular case, it was all about backing with the right metrics and hypothesis that if Age of Learning were to get into a progressive mobile-first segmentation platform. In this case, we went with Lean Plum. Lean Plum would offer us at scale A/B testing and experimentation efforts, which would effectively double the frequency of our product launches. That was really my pitch to the senior management. And when they started looking at the potential, that we had as a small pilot that we did with some of the tests on the on our core flagship product in ABC Mouse, they begin to realize what I was talking about, Arash. So it's a combination of the messaging combined with proper facts and I should say data intuition, if you will, that will effectively help us get over some of these ups.
Sure, you gotta show them that there's a better way to do something, and then prove it, right?
Absolutely, man.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. All right, cool. I know you had some interesting thoughts about kind of when you are building out a team. In today's world, it seems like people want 2 people in one, 3 people in one. They want a lot of skills in one person, and sometimes that's tough. So maybe kind of walk us through what you're seeing in the data space from a technical perspective when it comes to skill sets. I know there's a lot of listeners that might be a really strong data engineer, might be a really strong data scientist, but then you get asked to do a lot of things. What do you think, and where do you see things going?
Great question. I think in order to answer that, Arash, first of all, I want to remind viewers that when it comes to data as an enterprise asset in organizations, I feel there's a lot of misconceptions in terms of how data is valued, both as an economic mode as well as a cross-functional discipline within the company. In many ways, your I should say the business analysts and the reporting engineers that work in the back end are the ones that directly deal with stakeholders with the likes of product and other business teams. But what ends up happening is the actual hard work that the data engineer and or an instrumentation engineer who works at the front end of this value chain brings to the table sometimes gets unnoticed, and it effectively circles back to the fundamental theme of your question in terms of organizations not really understanding what the nuances of some of these roles are fundamentally. And to make it more complicated in the cloud-first environment that we all live in, the AWS and the Microsoft Azures and the GCPs of the world make it even more complicated to abstract a lot of these functions. Like, I'll give you a very practical use case. At Hulu, when I made the pitch for creating a separate data sciences team that was fundamentally built on clustering analysis and predictive analytics of our core content management in the context of the shows and series level data that Hulu ingests from millions and millions of data sources on a monthly basis, it was frowned upon at the time. And in fact, I was actually discouraged not to get into that habit of creating new additional functions within the data team, primarily because the media studios who jointly owned Hulu at the time didn't really understand what it took for us to have a progressive predictive analytics cadence. We ended up creating a separate Tiger team in the context of some of these rules to highlight how much of an impetus and return on investment some of these shows will have on Hulu's underlying business. So where I'm going with this is there is a forward-looking messaging combined with a very strong element of roles and responsibilities that need to be properly vetted out with your HR and recruiting functions. One of the first orders of priority that I always do whenever I join a new organization is when I evaluate talent in the team, I literally have my HR business partner as like my go-to person.
Sure.
In terms of identifying what the career ladder should be, what the personality traits are within the team, and as an extension to it, you start looking at what are the different fundamental roles that you need to align some of these flavors of engineers for. So, in a true sense, when you look at the entire supply chain, all the way from your data ingestion to your processing to the actual platform responsible for the data plumbing, if you will, and all the way into the backend reporting and the business analytics side of things, you need to have a clear vision of how do you want to bootstrap this team. And To add one other layer of complexity to this, if it becomes a geographically dispersed team, which in today's world is the norm pretty
Should
much.
be normal, yeah.
It makes it, all the more harder, Arash, because the kind of interactions you need to have with your product and engineering teams, data has to be a face in the room to all of this. So, getting to the larger theme of your question in terms of the fabrics of an organization, I would say, to sum it all, there has to be a proper, working synergy with your HR business function and your recruiting team in terms of understanding the wants and the needs of the org, and also you need to put yourself and the organization in a position where globally skill is not an issue, if you will.
Sure. And I was going to say, with a lot of digital transformation and everything moving over to the cloud, if you're already not there, it sounds like for, definitely a data engineer, even on the data scientist side, getting exposure to any of the three main cloud providers and understanding that world, that's a huge thing moving forward for anybody that's either getting into the space or that's already there and might not have exposure to that. Is that accurate?
That's a great point, and I would absolutely attest to that, Arash, because part of it is in the world that we have all lived in and grown. When you look at the pre-cloud environment, it was all on-prem, dedicated software, running dedicated Hadoop or Cloudera or Hortonworks clusters at scale, and the function of a data engineer at that time was effectively being a software developer responsible for handling parallel code at the fundamental level. That is what was happening. You split a single job into multiple different jobs, and as a software developer, you find a way to assimilate the data together. But in the cloud environment that we live in, there is a fundamental shift in terms of how software developers interact with the binary bits and pieces of data, if you will, right? I mean, the underlying code functionality has been fully abstracted at the expense of the quote-unquote data engineers not being an engineer anymore, right? It's more in the context of an application level interface that you are interacting with. So what happens is the next generation data community has a very narrow siloed view of what is actually happening beneath the hood, if you will, in terms of understanding the core technicality and the functions that churn these massive amounts of data at scale. As a very bare bones example, at Age of Learning, we struggled quite a bit with moving into the serverless stack for AWS because we are burning a lot of dollars with on-demand instances to the tune of $500,000 every year. And one of my first orders of priority was to how do you really get around this capex burn that we have, at the same time also getting to a point where our engineers feel motivated, because half of them didn't even know what it would take to write a simple serverless Lambda function. So it involves a very strong learning and development cadence combined with the right mindset to get beneath the hoods and really understand the plumbing. And once we migrated to AWS Lambda, the next thing the company saved more than 300 grand in annual capex savings. I mean, it was that big a differentiator.
So when you see that kind of learning gap from team members, in this particular case, it sounds like there was some gaps, between current skills to learning some cloud environment skills, particular AWS. From a learning perspective, what steps do you take in that situation, knowing that you're going to make this move and the current staff needs to learn X? What do you typically do to get people, one, to buy in, to be motivated, and to actually kind of learn what you need them to learn?
Absolutely. There is a heat skills map, that I would strongly advocate all leaders and, all organizations dealing with data and engineering. What it is it's at a very simplistic level. It's a two-dimensional mapping of all of your resources on the team against the skill sets that they have, both technical as well as soft skills. And that to me sets the blueprint for what you have in terms of the organic talent within the organization, Arash. And within the data world, that can mean a lot of different things, right? I mean, as you called out earlier, when it comes to the cloud environment, does a data engineer actually write code on the AWS stack, or is he or she more of an application level developer interacting with some of the transforms, that mask a lot of this data? That could be a very critical differentiation. And
Sure.
similarly, between a data scientist and a business analyst, are they essentially doing the same function, or are they performing more of a statistical computation in the context of visualization? So a lot of these nuances you start surfacing when you have these skills map. And as an extension to it, once you get to a point where you identify what the gaps are within the team, then it becomes relatively easier at that point, Arash, in my opinion, because you are able to inculcate that as part of the active coaching cadence for your organization. So be it performance reviews, be it return feedback from your managers, it makes it much more actionable on the employee, knowing that there is a path they are going towards. And lastly, in the world that we live in, it's become so much easier, to get certifications at scale, right? So there is Udemy, there is, AWS certifications of the world. There is also a lot of pretty immersive boot camps that I would recommend people who are going to be, part of going through this journey or are contemplating some of this. As an example, USC, UCLA give a lot of data analytics boot camps throughout the year. In fact, I have been presenter at couple of them over the last several years, and it's a very brilliant network of professionals to be a part of.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say like a skills heat map, and I think if you're any level employee and you're looking to level up, doing that for yourself and using your current teammates as the baseline, that can help you even identify where you need to grow, right? So I think it's, as a leader, identifying the gaps in your team is obviously great, but as an individual contributor, you can do the same thing yourself, assess your current skills, use that with your manager and say, look, this is where I think I'm at. What do you think? And then kind of be able to develop a career path to also improve your skills. So as an individual, you're not always reluctant and reliant, I guess, on kind of what the org is doing and where they're going, so you can kind of keep growing your skills.
Definitely, absolutely. And it is definitely a two-way function there, Arash.
Yeah, always a two-way street to grow. Awesome. I think it's always interesting getting interviewed, being interviewed. I feel like it's a part of daily life, whether it's personal, professional, but in a professional setting, for you particularly, when you have to hire, is there anything that you're ideally looking for outside of, solid technical background, depending on the role? What other components do you kind of look to identify when you're going through an interview cycle?
Great question. Frankly speaking, when I look at the hiring workflow, one of the fundamental aspects of, I believe, of high performing, optimal organizations at scale is the rigor that they put into hiring, Arash, irrespective of the level that you are in and the type of roles that you are looking for to fill, there has to be a constant synergy between every single aspect of this process, all the way from profiling the role to, creating the perfect, job description that would get your best of line candidates to apply for the role, all the way into, making sure that your recruiting and your talent acquisition partners understand the type of profile that they need to look at. So with this background, it really starts with the hiring manager creating a compelling path to get this hire filled as soon as possible, in the larger interest of the company as well as the organization here. And when it comes to the actual mechanics of the interview, usually what I prefer is we have a pre-brief ritual. In pretty much every single company that I've been a part of, there is a pre-brief ritual where all of the parties involved get together and we go over the semantics of what I just described, all the way from the profiling to the sourcing to the type of candidates that we would look for. And then once we have nailed down on what the next steps need to be, depending on the type of the role and or seniority of the candidate, we may go in for a couple of phone screens before the actual on-site or the final loop happens. Or in some cases, if it's an intern or fresh out of school graduate, we would have them go through a coding exercise.
Sure.
I have to admit, in the world that we live in today, there's a lot of amazing tools out there, the likes of, Lead Code or, CoderPad or SQL tutorials. I mean, everybody from the Facebooks and, the Amazons of the world, all the way to upcoming startups have been using these platforms for several years now. And I would strongly advocate our community to get familiarized with it. People who are, listening to this podcast, who are in our network, extended networks, please take the time and, really understand the type of problems that these platforms, provide. It's very often a lot of these questions come up in some of the biggest companies out there. And it's a pretty regular, cadence that these companies follow.
Sure.
Personally, for me, once we get past the tactical, technical aspects, of the interview process, two fundamental things that I look for in candidates is, one, how are they able to relate to the fundamental culture of the company and the organization? Each company is different. Every organization is fundamentally wired differently. So, not knowing much about the company and or the organization, how do I really see this person, fitting into the culture? Are they flexible enough where they can put themselves in a position where they can learn, they can be vulnerable, but at the same time, they can also grow the people around them. And last but not the least, the passion element. Right? How interested are they in the role? Have they really looked at doing honest research about the company? Or are they just, simply looking at some blog articles and talking to us about that in the context of just memorizing a few lines and letting us know. So some of these things, they go a long way, Arash. And I want to give you a very recent example, that has struck in my memory in this context. I actually had a candidate who was so interested in our role that she offered to work to us for free.
Wow.
Literally, I mean, she said, like, you guys don't even have to pay me anything. I just want to work for a huge educational technology brand like you guys are. None of us are obviously going to have her do that type of a job without paying her, but you get my point, right? I mean,
Sure.
It was a way to it was so enamoring for us to really hear that as an employer, that okay, there is this person who wants to work for us for free.
Yeah, no, it's I think the passion element sometimes as an interviewer, it's a fine line, right? You don't want to come across like super excited because sometimes that can be perceived that maybe you're a little bit desperate. So it's always, I think, fine lines. But I do agree that I think doing your research as much as you can beforehand. And again, I think it's kind of interviewing 101, have some good questions prepared. But again, preparation is a key to success. And going into any interview, know where you're going and have an intent, not just because I hear sometimes people are just like, well, I just really want a job to get more money or the title or whatever. And I think that intent comes through on the other side when you're getting interviewed. So be cognizant of that. Obviously, people understand that you're trying to increase your life in different ways, but people also want to work with people that have a passion for where they're at and kind of what the company does. I think nowadays it's a huge part of an interview loop. Awesome. So I know sometimes interviews go great. You're like, hey, this person was awesome. The team agrees. We're all looking to hire them or her. And then they start and you're soon enough, you're like, maybe we made a mistake. What did we miss? So I always think you can learn from mistakes. And if you don't make it twice, then maybe it's not a mistake and you're learning. So is there any stories you have in that sense? Maybe you can walk us through something where you thought maybe you had the right hire and I guess maybe it wasn't the case.
No, absolutely, Arash. And in fact, it's funny, you asked me this question because this actually happened with my very first hire, back in the day at Yahoo. And, you can imagine, I was a newbie manager at the time, trying to prove myself, grow my brand, grow my PR. And next thing you have this person. He was an expert in the operational monitoring space, and at the time, Yahoo had several, I should say, thousands and thousands of servers, globally dispersed. That we wanted to monitor their uptime, their metrics, some of the more core day-to-day operational metrics, and our team, there was a DevOps component within our team that was responsible for scaling this infrastructure. And we had hired this person initially as a contractor for 6 months, and he did a great job. And next thing you know, the team wanted him badly, and we ended up converting him into a full time. And next thing you know, one by one, problems start creeping up. And it was one of those experiences, Arash, where it's one thing to have cultural, misfit within the organization, that people are, not getting along well with each other, or this person is not a team player. But it assumes a whole new meaning when there is behavioral issues that deeply resonate with racist, tendencies and or fundamental, behavioral problems. And that is where, unfortunately, I really couldn't, in that context, as a hiring manager, understand, what was happening. And given my recent transition into the role, it made it even more difficult, in the sense that you have this very senior person, and the entire team around him doesn't want to work with him anymore. There is escalations all over the place. HR has been involved multiple times, dealing with this guy. And for me, fundamentally, it was a very demoralizing experience, because I just felt I had not just defeated myself, but I defeated my whole team because of this. Especially being put in a role where I was responsible for building and grooming this entire function grounds up. So there are two critical takeaways, that took away from that, at the onset. One, you really cannot, figure out what the emotional intelligence of a person is, and or the cultural aspect, unless and until you really start working with the individual, like on a day-to-day basis, right? And then for that, for us to be able to be aligned on the interview process, you have to put in a lot of checks and balances in place. I mean, there is honestly a reason why some of the best companies on this planet, they look at STAR type of techniques. I mean, I'm sure you have heard of STAR.
Yep.
Situation, task, action, reaction. It's very important that you really put a lot of rigor into the behavioral type of cadence, in your interview loop. So that was my first takeaway. And in fact, about 3 weeks ago, I read this interesting article. This was from Facebook's head of global HR, where she said she always asks every candidate that gets hired into Facebook the same question: go back to a situation in your professional life where you felt that you did a bad job, either as a manager or as an individual contributor. And when the person gives that answer, she would go back and ask, okay, now that you know that you made a mistake, what is it that you would do differently?
Sure.
And I felt, this was such a brilliant question, right? First of all, you really understand the emotional, maturity that this person has gone through, right? And if they really feel that, they are wrong about something, they would open up to you in a very genuine way. And that to me, so this incident, that happened to me at Yahoo, really opened up the doors for what I shouldn't be doing when it comes to, hiring. And ultimately, we ended up, putting this person on a performance improvement plan, and he successfully came out of it. Although, the wounds, that have remained, it's still hard to fathom.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because that was a contract to hire situation. Typically, in those instances, you've gotten a taste of the product, right? The person's work, their ability to interact with people, so you feel more confident before taking the next step of bringing them on. But it sounds like, to all the managers out there, even contract to hire situations, things can change once somebody becomes a full-time employee. So I guess nothing is ever for sure. But to your point, as long as you learn from it and you put in a practice of how to remedy a bad hire, because I think nobody goes into a situation foreseeing in a situation where it's not going to go good. But I think having a fail-safe also to check in with this person to make sure that you're looking at, metrics and or just touch bases to identify whether they're on track to what you did interview, allows you to identify sooner if something's not on course, to be able to rectify it. And for both parties, if it's not working out, it happens. It's much better for both parties to part ways sooner than not, so everybody can kind of go someplace where they can hopefully, flourish a lot more. So I know you obviously like to read different things, not just technical articles, but on hiring and things like that to make you overall at your level now as a manager better. I know you mentioned for you personally, just to stay abreast of kind of what's going on at a high level in the technology space. There's a couple of things that you tune into. Feel free to share with us kind of what those are, and then what you look to get while you're kind of trying to learn more about kind of what's happening in the industry.
Absolutely. I think when it comes to the learning and development cadence, Arash, I personally feel it's a lifelong pursuit. That each of us need to have, irrespective of the roles and where we are in our relative disciplines. And I have to admit, along those lines, when I look at TED Talks, as an experience, not just as a viewer, but some of the fundamental game-changing, emotional complexities, come out with these TikToks. The likes of Bill Gates and Simon Sinek and Oprah Winfrey's of the world. Everyone, there is a personal story in all of us, that this amazing medium has been able to inspire and empower for generations to come. And I'm a strong believer in making sure that the audience today hears this loud and clear. If any of you have the time to and the resources to spend about 10 to 15 minutes of your week just going through some of these motivational talks, it will do a fundamental difference to your life. And it can be on any topic. It doesn't have to be something that you are doing related to your work. In fact, a lot of times, I look at talks that talk about prioritization of your time. Why is it that, and in fact, there was one recent talk that this person who's a researcher from Berkeley, was talking about why it is actually good to procrastinate versus having set goals in life. It was a very humorous talk, but it had a fundamental theme to it in terms of how humans are wired fundamentally different when it comes to reacting versus perceiving things from the other aspects. So,
do you feel like, especially for the data community, because those roles are so tied into business, and as much as business is revenue driven, bottom line, things to that nature, depending on the product, the service, the organization that you're at, this EQ, emotional, intelligence, thought process, it's such a big part of the impact to how businesses go about and what happens in society, laws that get passed, don't get passed. It has such an impact across the board. It sounds like to me, you're suggesting that not only do people level up their technical skills, because you have to have those chops, but from the other perspective, in these roles in particular, understanding at a higher level how everything's tied in. We're all human, so that element's not going away. That's a big differentiator for people to excel in their roles, because now they're being able to kind of mesh and make those worlds kind of come together more. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, thank you, Arash. Yeah, no, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And part of it is, when you are part of a highly cross-functional team, as you mentioned, the likes of data or DevOps or site reliability, there is a central theme to it. By default, any employee in these organizations are expected to also have, I should say, an intuitive business sense. Right? I mean, there is a piece to it where there are so many stakeholders that we all interact with. Like while I was at Hulu, my daily job involved me to interact with 90 to 95 different stakeholders, some of whom I had never even met earlier in my life. Right?
Sure.
I mean, it's like you're talking with the likes of Disney and Apple TV and Samsung, and it's as much as it's a data element, it's also a huge people element to it in terms of setting your vision, understanding that there is alignment, and when you put yourself in a position where you are learning through the lens of some of these famous personalities who have gone through or been there, done that, and gone through some of the hardships in life, I feel it's a very refreshing path to have, and from a core technical I should say, because you talked about it at the onset in terms of understanding the marketplace and really understanding what's going on. There is in the online world that we all live in, there are a zillion options, Arash, in terms of like everything from CNET to TechCrunch to Wall Street Journal Tech to the specific tech stories on Yahoo. I pick and choose multiple different elements from many of these editorial sites that cover different aspects of our business. Like if I have to pick on data, I would probably go to TechCrunch. If I want to pick on applications, I will look at CNET. If I want to look at what's happening in the cloud world, it could be going through AWS, Amazon Web Services blogs.
Sure.
There is a plethora of different options out there. The only advice that I would give is it becomes very fragmented and it can be very easy to lose track of time. So know what you are doing and make sure that there is a single consistent set of resources that you refer every time.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it's a good strategy. I was telling you off air that I follow TechCrunch on my Instagram. So, there are different ways, especially for how people get their data and, whether it's through, social or their phones, there's a lot of different ways to stay connected with what's going on in the world. And I think obviously having a business component, because the one thing I do hear from a lot of managers is, from a technical perspective, the data engineer, data scientist, they're nails. They're very good. But sometimes it's talking to the different business units. So just kind of understanding what's happening just overall, I think it opens up for conversations, especially if you got to, go to stakeholders and you need something from them to do your job more effectively. It's good just to have talking points and things of interest. So I'm a big TED Talk listener myself. So I'm a huge fan. So I think there's always stuff to learn out there. Lastly, I was going to focus on, I know you've been an advisor to different startups, and I know there's a lot of people that are, further along in their career, and it might be something that they've never thought of, or they have thought of, and they're not really sure how to go about potentially being one. Maybe their network's not strong enough. But I was curious, for the positions that you have been, a technical advisor, how did those positions come up, and what suggestions would you have to anybody that would potentially want to become an advisor in the future?
Absolutely. Great question. I would say, to address the first part of your question, my stint with entrepreneurs and early stage growth companies really began as an extension of some of the fundamental success stories that I was able to generate at the likes of Yahoo and Hulu, Arash, because what ends up happening is, and it goes to the previous theme that you called out, in the sense when you put yourself in a position where the likes of several different business stakeholders start interacting and aligning with your vision, it becomes very natural that that network starts growing. And over a period of time, it becomes imminent that people are going to be looking for your services in terms of bootstrapping their organizations. And
Sure.
I have to admit, there was a phase in my career where I honestly resisted being part of the startup world, because to me, as you can see from my profile, I've all along been with large companies, trusted brands, and it was
Startups can be scary.
correct. They can be scary, and there is an element of risk associated with it, especially if things don't work out. Then you're kind of your plan B, and your margin of error is very limited. So from that standpoint, it was always a dicey proposition for me. But when I started interacting with this community, I realized there is so much for me to learn. What I had assumed, all along, was probably less than 2% of what is out there in reality, right? And my advice to budding entrepreneurs and those who want to be part of the advisory circle is try to go beyond the product engineering world and try to put yourself in a position where you are learning the business model of some of these fundamental companies. As an example, one of my very first startups that I was involved with was this financial micro investing company by the name Acons. I'm sure many of you have heard about it. It's effectively evolved into a $1 billion unicorn today. But back in the day, this is almost about 8 years ago, Acons was actually struggling building their entire data analytics function. It was things were all over the place. They lacked focus. And at the time, one of their founding members, they reached out to me through common LinkedIn, networks, looking at what it would take for me to invigorate this team, build a predictable delivery cadence centered around the economic value of data. And at the time, for me, this was an interesting challenge because I had never learned financial micro investing as a business before. I had to first understand their customers, their product portfolio. And as we started looking more and more into the business, we realized the company was frankly doing a lot of its fundamental rigor very correctly. It was just that it was being interpreted in a totally different way when it comes to the execution from a management standpoint. So where I'm going with this is, when you look at it from a core potential, advisory role and or advisory partnership standpoint, we prepared to have a lot of back and forth, with the founders, with the folks that are in the room that are responsible for making some of these decisions. It's going to be imperative that there is a phase to it where there is going to be a lot of maturity required. I mean, they may not align with you, you may not align with them, and it's very easy to get frustrated and leave the path. But persistence and hard work can go a long way. And then once you hit a point where the results become self-explanatory, then sky is the limit. I mean, at that point of time, it's all about maturing and really growing, that vertical.
Sure. Yeah. So it sounds like the more successful you are, the more people hear about it and the more people want to tap into how you did it. So for those that are listening, because I know there's a lot of people that have been successful and they just don't necessarily pursue the networking side of taking advantage of their success, right? So it sounds like it just kind of compiles once you kind of get the ball moving. Awesome. I like to always ask, last question, professionally speaking, is there anything that comes to mind if you could go back, maybe have a redo? Is there anything that comes to mind that maybe you'd like to share if you had another chance, you might do it a little bit differently so far?
Yes, absolutely. I would say in terms of lacking, the focus on data initially, Arash, because since the theme is all about data and analytics and how to bring a data-driven culture within organizations, I feel as much as I was part of the data journey right from the beginning, there could have been a much better sanity and maturity I could have applied to some of the roles, especially during the first 3 to 5 years of my career here in this country, moving from India, because I feel at the time a lot of the practices that the software industry had were rooted in archaic development and on-prem, infrastructure assets. I feel, if there is one thing that I can go back, if I would have been a little bit more proactive about, what some of these industry strengths would be, how a Netflix of the world would have, really thought of binge watching back in 2006 or 2007.
Sure.
Would have probably been in a much different place. Perhaps, my desire, which has not been fulfilled yet, until this point, Arash, is to have my own business, as it relates to grooming, a data-centric, culture and
sure,
rigor in organizations. And I feel starting the path on the right note there would have probably, blended itself well down the line. But hey, I'm still chasing it.
Hey. It's never too late. So dreams still come true. So awesome. Well, Sri, it's been a pleasure. We greatly appreciate you joining us on this episode. So thanks again to everyone listening. And Sri's on LinkedIn. He's at Age of Learning. He's been a great guest. And again, appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Arash. Thanks a lot.
That's it for this episode. I'll be back again with a different guest, a different topic. Until then, please like, subscribe, share, leave a comment wherever you are watching or listening to this episode. I can't thank you enough if you do. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.